night sky over Caracas did not go dark on January 3, 2026. Instead, it turned into fire. At 3 o'clock hours local time, the silence of the Venezuelan capital was shattered not by the familiar sounds of local unrest, but by the terrifying, rhythmic thud of precision-guided munitions. Residents in the Libertador municipality looked up to see the trails of cruise missiles illuminating the valley, slamming into the fortified walls of Fuerte Tuna and the runways of La Carlota Air Base. This was not a skirmish. This was not a coup attempt by disaffected generals. This was the full weight of the United States military machine crashing down on the Bolivarian Republic. And by the time the sun rose over the smoke-choked skyline, the impossible had happened. Nicolas Maduro, the man who defied sanctions, coup attempts, and international isolation for over a decade, was gone. Plucked from the presidential palace by elite US forces and flown to New York to face trial. Welcome to the British Lens. Today, we are analyzing an event that has fundamentally rewritten the rules of international relations in the 21st century. We are dissecting the United States bombardment of Caracas and the extraterritorial extraction of a sitting head of state. This is Operation Absolute Resolve. We will look beyond the breaking news banners to understand the military mechanics of how the US penetrated one of the most heavily defended airspaces in South America. We will analyze the geopolitical shockwaves hitting Moscow and Beijing, and we will ask the critical question: is this the restoration of democracy, or is it the violent return of the Monroe Doctrine in its most aggressive form? We are witnessing a historical pivot point comparable to the invasion of Panama in 1989 or Iraq in 2003. The world has changed overnight. To understand why American missiles are raining down on Caracas today, we must look at the long, tortuous road that led us here. The relationship between Washington and Caracas has been in a death spiral since the rise of Hugo Chavez and his Bolivarian Revolution in 1999. Venezuela sits atop the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, yet its economy has completely collapsed, driving millions of its citizens to flee. For years, the strategy of Washington was one of economic strangulation and diplomatic isolation. They recognized opposition leaders, they imposed sanctions on PDVSA, the state oil company, and they placed a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head, unsealing indictments for narco-terrorism in 2020. But the strategy of maximum pressure had stalled. Maduro, supported by intelligence from Cuba, military hardware from Russia, and loans from China, had proved resilient. He purged the military of disloyal officers and relied on armed paramilitary groups, the collectivos, to maintain order. However, the geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically in late 2025. With global energy markets in flux and the United States seeking to secure its hemisphere against Eastern influence, the calculus in Washington changed. The narrative shifted from containment to removal. The return of Donald Trump to the presidency brought with it a foreign policy team that viewed the presence of Russian and Iranian assets in Venezuela not just as an annoyance, but as an existential threat to US national security. The justification for this attack was not just regime change, it was framed as a counter-narcotics operation and a defense of the American homeland against a criminal enterprise masquerading as a government. Let us transition into a deep dive analysis of the military execution of this operation. How did the United States pull this off? Venezuela possesses, on paper, one of the most sophisticated air defense networks in Latin America, anchored by the Russian-made S-300BM systems. These batteries should have been able to track and engage incoming threats. The fact that US missiles struck the Miraflores Palace and La Carlota airbase with impunity suggests a massive failure of these systems. This indicates a precursor phase of intense electronic warfare and cyber attacks. It is highly probable that US Cyber Command blinded the Venezuelan radar network hours before the first Tomahawk was launched from naval destroyers in the Caribbean. The strike package was likely a combination of sea-launched cruise missiles to degrade air defenses and command and control centers, followed by the insertion of special operations forces. Reports indicate that the extraction of Maduro was carried out by Delta Force or a similar Tier 1 unit, utilizing stealth helicopters that evaded detection until they were hovering over the palace grounds. This mirrors the 1989 invasion of Panama, where the US military seized Manuel Noriega. However, the scale here is vastly different. Caracas is a dense urban environment of millions, surrounded by mountains, making it a nightmare for military planners. The precision required to hit military targets within the city without causing mass civilian casualties implies the use of low-yield, high-precision munitions and real-time intelligence assets on the ground. We must also analyze the legal and diplomatic dimension. The United States has effectively kidnapped a foreign head of state. While Washington cites the 2020 narco-terrorism indictments as legal cover, under international law, this is an act of war. It challenges the Westphalian concept of sovereignty. The US argument is that Maduro was running a criminal cartel, the cartel of the suns, rather than a legitimate government, thus stripping him of sovereign immunity. This is a dangerous precedent. It signals to the world that if you are an adversary of the United States, your borders and your title offer no protection. Economically, the motivation cannot be ignored. Venezuela's oil infrastructure is dilapidated but vast. Under Maduro, production plummeted. With a US-installed transitional government, Washington aims to rehabilitate the Venezuelan energy sector. This would flood the market with oil, potentially lowering global prices and reducing the leverage of other petrostates like Russia and Saudi Arabia. It is a resource grab disguised as a liberation, or a liberation fueled by resources, depending on your perspective. Now, let us evaluate the impact and the potential scenarios that face us in the coming days. Scenario 1 is total chaos and civil war. The head of the snake has been cut off, but the body is still trashing. The Venezuelan military is fractured. While some units may surrender to the overwhelming US firepower, the ideological hardliners and the armed collectivos may retreat into the barrios and the jungles to wage a guerrilla war. This would turn Venezuela into a Latin American Iraq, a quagmire of insurgency, IEDs, and urban combat that could drag US forces into a years-long occupation. Scenario 2 is the swift installation of a transitional council. The US has stated it will temporarily run the country. This implies a roadmap where a coalition of opposition leaders and technocrats is installed, backed by American bayonets, to organize elections. If the Venezuelan populace, exhausted by years of hunger and poverty, accepts this intervention as a necessary evil to restore normalcy, we could see a rapid stabilization. However, this relies on the Venezuelan military standing down, which is a massive variable. Scenario 3 is the international backlash. How do Moscow and Beijing respond? Russia has invested billions in Venezuela and views it as a strategic foothold. China is Venezuela's largest creditor. They have just seen their assets liquidated by American missiles. While they are unlikely to start World War III over Caracas, they will retaliate. We could see increased aggression in Ukraine, or China making a decisive move in the South China Sea, calculating that the US is now distracted and overextended in South America. We might also see asymmetric attacks, cyber attacks on US infrastructure or the arming of anti-American groups globally. We must also consider the humanitarian impact. Caracas is currently without power. The bombing has damaged infrastructure. A population that was already suffering from food shortages is now in a war zone. We could see a fresh wave of refugees heading towards the Colombian and Brazilian borders, destabilizing the entire region. The optics of American bombs falling on a Latin American capital will also reignite anti-American sentiment across the global south. The ghosts of the Cold War, of Chile in 1973, of Guatemala in 1954, have been resurrected. The domestic political situation in the US is also a factor. President Trump has framed this as a decisive victory against socialism and drugs. It is a show of strength intended to project American dominance. However, if the occupation turns bloody, if American soldiers begin coming home in body bags, public support will evaporate quickly. In conclusion, the bombing of Caracas and the arrest of Nicolas Maduro is not the end of a story, it is the beginning of a volatile new chapter. The United States has crossed the Rubicon. It has abandoned the pretense of non-intervention and embraced a doctrine of aggressive, unilateral force to secure its hemisphere. We are witnessing the raw application of hard power. The message to the world is clear: the United States will tolerate no rivals in its backyard. But power always invites resistance. The removal of a dictator is the easy part, the rebuilding of a broken nation is where empires go to die. The coming weeks will determine whether this operation is remembered as a masterstroke of geopolitical strategy that liberated a nation and secured energy independence, or as a catastrophic blunder that plunged South America into flames and isolated the United States on the world stage. We at the British Lens will be monitoring the situation hour by hour. We are watching the movements of the Russian Navy. We are watching the streets of Caracas. And we are watching the oil markets. What do you think? Was this a necessary intervention to stop a narco-state, or is it an illegal act of imperialist aggression? Is the world safer today with Maduro in a New York jail cell, or have we just opened Pandora's box? This is history happening in real time.